So thank you all for being here today. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces. It's pretty exciting for us to get to present the research that we conducted in New Zealand over the last 7 or 8 months. Really the culmination of our hard work over 2 years, and for these incredible professors to thank for that. My name is Basaraba.
I'm Leah Zamesnik.
And our research was centered around the perceptions on shared decision making in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tongariro National Park, excuse me. So to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to kind of start with some context about Tongariro National Park and the Treaty of Waitangi and why that's relevant and important for our research. We're going to start with our research questions and cover some of the foundational academic literature on shared decision making. We'll cover our methodology, our results, our final conclusions, and other areas of critical thought. And then we're going to be able to give our reflections about our time here. Yeah. So we're actually going to be, a little disclaimer here, we're going to be using some Maori words. This is out of the understanding that these words can't be easily translated into English, and that for the sake of our viewers in New Zealand that will be seeing this presentation, I would like to be able to maintain those concepts in the way that they're supposed to be represented. So Tongariro National Park is located on the central North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's about 5 hours south of the major city center, Auckland, and it's about 5 hours north of the capital, Wellington, down here. I don't know if you can see way in the back, this lake in the central part of the island. It's just southwest of there, and there are 2 major national highways that run on both sides of the park. Tongariro National Park is about 200,000 acres, which is roughly 3/4 the size of Rocky Mountain National Park, to give you a little bit of context. As I mentioned, there are 2 national highways that surround the park on both sides. Therefore, it is easily accessible by a large number of people. For example, in 2003, nearly 1 million people visited the park. It is the first national park created in Aotearoa, and it's the 4th in the world. It was the 4th in the world. It's now currently one of 13 national parks in the country. Significantly, it's also the first UNESCO Dual World Heritage Site. The United Nations Environmental, Science, and Cultural Organization has only given this prestigious honor to 31 other locations globally. It is a dual World Heritage Site not only for its environmental attributes and unique volcanic landscape, but also for its cultural identity. Essential to the park are its 3 iconic and active volcanoes, Mount Tongariro, Mount Ngauruhoe, and Mount Ruapehu. With other volcanic hotspots, they make up the southern terminus of the Ring of Fire. They are currently active. Last recent eruptions happened in 2012, and every number of years they erupt again over and over. As I mentioned previously, it is a dual World Heritage Site for its ecological and its cultural attributes. To the indigenous people of New Zealand, Maori, this is an incredibly significant and special place, and these mountains hold a deep sacred and spiritual connection. We'll cover that here in just a few more slides. Ecologically, it's an incredibly special place as well. 11 different ecosystems are represented here, from high alpine glacial lakes to lowland desert to hard podocarp forest, native beech forest, peat bogs, among others. It is home to New Zealand's only indigenous mammal, the bat, as well as a number of other iconic species such as this flightless brown kiwi, North Island brown kiwi. Flightless birds of New Zealand evolved in isolation over millennia and are an incredibly special part of the country. This picture up in the top right-hand corner is of a wood pigeon, or whakeriru, and this beautiful parrot down below is the kaka. So economically, it's a significant place for the country. It's arguably one of the highest visited parks in the country. Due to recent decline in the demand for New Zealand's top export dairy products, tourism has quickly taken the lead to be New Zealand's largest earner. There are 3 major ski fields on the mountains, Whakapapa, Turoa, and Takino. and they see a huge amount of domestic tourists every year. And there are some other extremely iconic hikes within the park that garner a huge amount of international attention. So as I was mentioning, this park and the mountains hold a deep-rooted significance for the indigenous peoples of this area and of Aotearoa. We're going to be using this term Tangata Whenua to generally describe Maori people. And this translates essentially to mean the people of the land. More specifically, we're going to be using the term Na Iwi o Te Kawi Maunga, or the collective tribes of the chiefly cluster of mountains, or Na Iwi for short. And these are the collective of tribes that hold deep reverence for this park and for the mountains themselves. So traditionally, territory was constantly expanding and contracting based on disputes over tribal territories, land, and resources. Tangata Whenua did not reside permanently on the mountains themselves, rather moved in a nomadic and seasonal pattern, determined by availability of resources and time of the year. This is an incredibly harsh landscape of the mountains themselves. Tangata Whenua relied solely on this land for their livelihood. Not only did they harvest bird species and plants for food, they utilized these natural materials and natural resources for cultural purposes, spiritual purposes, for clothing and garments, for weavings, for dyes, for carvings. So no words coming from my mouth will be able to depict the deep-rooted sacred connection that Tangata Whenua and Na Iwi have for these mountains or for the park. But in order to give you a little bit of context, Tangata Whenua, the iwi, or the tribes, and the hapu, sub-tribes, that associate themselves with mountains in this park, generally associate themselves with specific mountains, although all the mountains are significant. Na iwi believe that these mountains are their living, breathing ancestors, their tupuna, and that they hold their own mana, or authority from the gods, and their own maori, or life force, the breath of life. These mountains are deeply rooted in Na iwi's creation stories. We heard stories time and again about how only a generation ago the Kaumata, the elders of these communities, would shield their eyes when they're anywhere near the mountains out of deep reverence and respect. So central to the general Maori conservation ethic are these terms kaitiakitanga, mana whenua, and whakapapa. And these terms are relevant and important to better understand Na iwi's relationship to the mountains. Kaitiakitanga essentially translates to mean guardianship or stewardship of natural resources. And Tangata Whenua see themselves as part of the landscape, to be able to use the landscape in a sustainable way for their own well-being, for the well-being of their community and family, as well as for the intrinsic value of the environment itself. Mana whenua, this term that means authority over the land, and this authority is given by the gods, and allows them to exercise their right as kaitiaki, or guardians. And this term whakapapa essentially translates to mean genealogy or lineage. And not only do Tangata Whenua relate strongly to their ancestors and to their broader kinship groups, but they also relate to the natural resources within the natural world, including waterways, the mountains, particular plants, and particular bird species. So we're going to be using this term Na iwi o Te Kawi Maunga to generally describe the tribes, the iwi and the hapu, the general group, smaller groupings of tribes that associate themselves with this area and with these mountains. There are a huge number of iwi and hapu that associate with this area. But the iwi and hapu with the most significant traditional rohe or territory in the land are these listed here: Ngāti Tuwharetoa, and their subsequent hapu: Ngāti Mananui, Ngāti Waiwai, Ngāti Hikaro, Ngāti Rangi, Ngāti Uanuku, and Ngāti Hawa. So in order for us to be able to present our research and methodology, we need to better understand some of the context around how the park was created and some of the binding legislation about how that was developed in the first place.
So our research takes place in modern-day New Zealand and in the context of Tongariro National Park, but we feel it's important to understand the Treaty of Waitangi and the history of the formation of New Zealand. So prior to 1840, New Zealand wasn't how we know it. It was known as Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud by the Maori. The 19th century brought a lot of European settler groups to Aotearoa for various reasons, but with these settler groups came increased conflict. This conflict was due to land ownership and land rights, and Maori saw their land disappearing at alarming rates. They were losing their rohe, their traditional land. Also at this time, the British Crown had a deep investment in bringing in Aotearoa into the Commonwealth, but they wanted to do this in a more civil way and not have it be as violent as their past colonies, especially Australia and the violence that occurred there with the Aboriginal people. So they drafted the Treaty of Waitangi. In Waitangi, in this building shown, the Treaty of Waitangi was drafted by representatives of the British Crown, but they consulted with Rangatira, or Māori chiefs. The document was seen as being mutually beneficial. Māori gained protection under the British Crown, and this protection would allow for less loss of their land. And the British Crown was able to establish authority in New Zealand, or what would become known as New Zealand, or Aotearoa New Zealand, signifying the partnership that was formed in the Treaty of Waitangi. However, like is common with a lot of treaties that happened during colonization, the Treaty of Waitangi failed to protect Māori land rights. The Crown, in the decades and years following the signing of the treaty, began to assert their authority in increasing levels over Maori. This happened through legislation that required iwi, tribal land, to be sold if the Crown felt that it wasn't being used to its best potential. It also required lands to be taken out of communal custody of the tribe and given to individual owners. This also allowed British settlers to be able to purchase land much more easily. Out of this, Māori land began to be alienated at the same amount of rates that it was prior. Because of this, iwi began to unify with each other in protest. These protests gained visibility in the middle of the 20th century and often involved land occupations in Waitangi, as you can see here, during Waitangi Day, which is kind of like 4th of July in New Zealand. As these protests gained visibility in the public, the Crown realized that they needed to address the grievances that were being brought forth by iwi. They did this through the establishment of what is now known as the treaty settlement process. Extremely complicated, but I'm going to try to break it down nice and simple here. The treaty settlement process is the process in which iwi can bring forth their claims where they feel that the Crown has breached the Treaty of Waitangi. They bring their claims to the Waitangi Tribunal, which is a Crown agency made up of historians and experts in their field. The Waitangi Tribunal is tasked with looking at the evidence brought forth by iwi and finding if their claims are grounded in history. If the tribunal feels that these claims are grounded in historical evidence and that the Crown has indeed breached the Treaty of Waitangi, they will put forth a recommendation of how to best appropriately and comprehensively redress these claims. The Waitangi Tribunal is not involved in negotiations, so these are merely recommendations, but oftentimes the negotiation process follows along with these recommendations. Negotiations occur between the Office of Treaty Settlements, representing the Crown, and a mandated iwi group representing the iwi. These negotiations typically take 5 to 6 years and involve a lot of work, and often the settlement involves cultural redress and financial redress, as well as an official apology for the Crown recognizing these past actions. Tongariro National Park is currently going through the treaty settlement process. They have not yet entered into negotiations, but they have gone through the Waitangi Tribunal process. I'll discuss these findings later, but first we need to understand how the Treaty of Waitangi has played out in the formation and modern-day management and governance of Tongariro National Park.
A lot of context. As Leah was mentioning, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840. The British Crown moved into the central part of North Island in 1869. And again, at a rapid rate, the Crown continued to acquire individually held Maori land. Due to increasing concern over the rapid expansion of Maori governance and management of these particular lands, the paramount chief of Ngāti Tuwharetoa, Horonuku Te Hiuhiu Te Kino IV, entered into an agreement with the Crown in order to share rangatiratanga, or this concept of chiefly authority and governance, as well as kaitiakitanga, guardianship and stewardship. This act was called in Maori a tuku, and some of the conditions that were required of this tuku were that the peaks be protected into eternity. You can see over here in this map, it's a little bit washed out, but these blue, this half crescent and those two circles up top signify the peaks, the 3 iconic volcanic peaks, the mountains. Among other conditions were that his lineage, his direct descendants, would have life trusteeship on the governance and management board of the park itself. So thus, Tongariro National Park was created in 1894. As you can see, the land that was acquired by the Crown continued to grow over time, and Maori were removed forcibly from the park boundaries. It's important to note that this act, this tuku, was represented, misrepresented, and mistranslated by the Crown as to be a gift by the noble indigenous peoples, a gift to the nation, representing the expansion of the native mind. This is important because the Crown represented this gift in order to retain ownership of the park, of the boundaries, as well as to govern and manage it for the future. This is actually still disputed today in part, and unfortunately still misrepresented by the governance and management agencies in the park. It's also important to note that not all iwi or tribes that had territory in the park and significance in the mountains agreed with this tuku, and this has important ramifications for the future of the governance and management of Tongariro National Park. So since 1894, the Crown has managed and governed the park in a number of various legislation and titles. Currently, the park is managed by the Department of Conservation. The Department of Conservation was created in 1987, and the Department of Conservation manages most public land within New Zealand, including the other 12 national parks and other public lands, protected areas. It's important to talk about some of the management complexities in the park itself that natural resource managers face. As you can see here, this possum, invasive species require a vast amount of capacity, resourcing, personnel, time, and often involve controversial methods of eradication. Again, as I mentioned previously, that the flightless birds of New Zealand evolved in isolation without any formal predators. And when invasive species came to the North Island, they've had a dramatic negative impact on the ecology and on the birds. In addition, the active volcanoes pose a serious threat to recreational users of the park, as you can see in this photo of the hut that was demolished by the eruptions in 2012. In addition, this next photo shows a photo of the Tongariro Alpine Crossing. This is a 19-kilometer hike over the top of this volcanic plateau, and it is one of the most iconic hikes in New Zealand, made most famous recently by the Lord of the Rings films. Mount Narahoe, the central volcano, the youngest volcano of the three, is featured as Mount Doom in the film. And this has garnered a huge amount of international recognition. Nearly 90,000 people cross the track a year, and this presents huge management complexities in terms of dealing with rubbish and sewage and waste, track maintenance, and the fact that this track goes directly over the top of these ancestors of Tongariro Naiwi. In addition, development on the mountains themselves. As the Crown acquired Maori-held land, they continued to develop higher and higher onto the mountain, into the Tuku area itself. This development includes ski lift development, ski lift infrastructure, hotels, huts, restaurants, cafes. So a little bit more context for you about how the Waitangi Tribunal process carried out in Tongariro National Park, and then we're going to get to our research.
So as I stated, the park is currently going through treaty settlements. They have not yet entered into negotiation, but they did go through the Waitangi Tribunal process. Over 41 claims were submitted by the members of Ngā Iwi o Te Kahui Maunga to the Waitangi Tribunal. Over several years, the tribunal looked at the evidence submitted by members of Ngā Iwi, as well as evidence put forth by the Crown in submission and response. In 2013, the tribunal released Y1130 Te Kahui Maunga, which was their in-depth analysis into all 41 claims put forth by Ngā Iwi. These claims dealt with a number of issues, but we're most focused on the management and governance of Tongariro National Park. Regarding the management and governance, the tribunal concluded that the treaty partnership has not been upheld in Tongariro National Park. This happened in a number of ways. First, the tribunal felt that Ngā Iwi has been excluded from exercising their role as kaitiaki, as guardians, as stewards over their rohe, their traditional land. The tribunal also felt that Ngāti Iwi has been excluded from their right to Rangatiratanga and Mana Whenua, their chiefly authority and their authority over their land. The tribunal also felt that DOC, as the managing agency of the Crown, has replaced shared decision-making and partnership with mere consultation, and that this consultation varies from iwi to iwi and is often inadequate. The tribunal also felt that Ngāti Iwi have been excluded from gaining economic opportunities in the park. Because of all this, the tribunal concluded that the Crown has fallen short to living up to its responsibilities to its treaty partners, Ngāti Iwi o Te Kahui Manga. With these conclusions, the Waitangi Tribunal recommended that the park now be jointly held and owned by the Crown and Ngāti Iwi o Te Kahui Manga, and that legislation mandates the statutory body that has equal representation from Ngāti Iwi and the Crown, most likely represented by the Department of Conservation as the land management agency. The statutory body should be equally responsible to Ngāti Iwi o Te Kahui Manga and the Crown. With this recommendation, we established our research. There was a desire from the people on the ground, so members of Ngāti Iwi and members of DOC staff, to understand the perceptions of what people are thinking on the ground around shared decision-making in Tongariro National Park. And we were able to act as the middle ground in between these two groups to conduct this research. Most specifically, the groups wanted to know, what are the perceived strengths of a shared decision-making partnership between DOC and Ngāti Iwi o Te Kahui Manga, and what are their perceived challenges? And with these perceived strengths and challenges, is Tongariro National Park a viable setting for shared decision-making? Just a disclaimer here on our research, we are in no way attempting to influence the treaty settlement process. We understand the sensitivity to the negotiation process. We're just merely exploring the recommendation put forth by the Waitangi Tribunal. Before we could begin our research, we had to wrap our heads around the complex academic literature surrounding the definitions of what it means to share decision-making in natural resource management.
So shared decision-making has used a number of various titles in the academic literature and practitioner literature. Most prominently, co-management. Co-management as a range of arrangements with different degrees of power sharing, joint decision-making by a state and communities about a set of resources or an area. But it became apparent early on in our conversations that co-management only represented a segment of shared decision-making in the context of New Zealand. That co-management represents the operational daily tasks, and that co-governance generally is the overarching vision setting where those tasks are then passed down. We're going to be using this term shared decision-making to generally include both the terms co-management and co-governance. So why shared decision-making? This is founded in the literature by scholars, by practitioners, by indigenous communities and other communities around the world, that the centralized command and control style of conservation that has proliferated in the world ultimately has failed to address the complex social ecological systems that natural resource managers face today. That the complex social ecological systems are dynamic, they're fluid, they're always changing, always evolving in these environmental conditions, and natural resource managers must be able to adapt using creative solutions to addressing these issues. In addition to indigenous communities calling for their right to be able to govern and manage lands that were significant to them. Some of the benefits, by incorporating diverse worldviews, you can gain a broader understanding and a unique way of looking at certain problems, as well as unique solutions to addressing these problems. In addition, being able to share the time, the capacity, the resources, the workload, and the personnel and training of a state agency or a community group can have positive outcomes for conservation and environment. In addition, it can lead to equity and efficiency of decision-making if it's done correctly. Some of the major challenges are being able to translate this theoretical idea into practice. Equitable power sharing remains a constant issue, especially in the context of a state agency that has removed indigenous peoples from their land and has governed and managed the land over a broad amount of time. In addition, being able to integrate diverse worldviews and perspectives, the indigenous worldview and the knowledge systems that go along with it, the traditional ecological knowledge, as well as Western science, it can be a huge challenge. It remains a huge hurdle. So to sum it all up, there are no panacea solutions for complex social ecological systems that natural resource managers face today. But shared decision-making has been used as a mechanism to create a more equitable and efficient decision-making process and be able to address some of these issues within these complex social ecological systems. There are foundational characteristics that can lead to successful shared decision-making, and this is prominent among the scholarship, or the scholarship literature, excuse me. Trust. Trust is essential to building relationships, but it must be viewed in the broader context of power relations. This takes time and it takes effort. Adaptability is crucial in natural resource management, especially in the context where natural resource managers are underfunded and understaffed to be able to address all the issues that they want to be able to address. Arrangements must be tested, adapted, and monitored in order to adapt to the changing circumstances and environmental circumstances that they face. This can build resilience of a system in a large way. Commitment to the process must come from the local level, the regional level, and the national level, and it must include dedicating the time, the resources, the personnel, and the training to be able to work across multiple boundaries and to be able to cultivate a shared decision-making process. Actors and partners must not only value diverse knowledge types, they must be able to utilize and act upon those decisions. This includes being able to recognize the spiritual, the cultural, and the intrinsic values that Indigenous peoples hold for their environment. And it can increase our understanding of biodiversity and governance for human well-being. Strong leadership requires development and support from the communities and the agencies that they come from. A strong leader must be able to work across multiple institutions and create opportunities for reflection and for learning. We believe foundational to this concept is this concept of the boundary span, or a person or people that are able to work across multiple worldviews, communicate well across multiple worldviews, organize and be able to facilitate effective decision-making processes and planning processes. Equitable power sharing is central to shared decision-making. This goes far beyond consultation. Equitable power sharing requires that actors be equally listened to, respected, informed, and part of the decision-making process. Another condition that can lead to successful shared decision-making is utilizing effective decision-making processes and conflict resolution mechanisms. Effective decision-making processes must be culturally appropriate, and conflict resolution mechanisms must be low cost and aim to maintain realistic expectations to be able to mediate or manage conflict rather than trying to resolve it. Conflict is inevitable in shared decision-making. In addition, strong communication is vital for defining the needs, the priorities, and objectives of partners, and again, must be culturally appropriate. So before we introduce our methodology and then our research, we'd like to introduce Kaupapa Māori research. Kaupapa Māori research is founded in the idea that the production of, and the implication of research traditionally in Māori communities has dehumanized Māori, and that research has benefited privileged ways of knowing, Western ways of knowing Western science, while disvaluing Māori language, protocol, customs, and knowledge systems. By exploiting, by taking, and by misrepresenting knowledge, this has led to some Māori communities rejecting all theory and all research. We had the wonderful opportunity to get introduced to the work of Linda Tuiwai-Smith and had the opportunity to speak with her. She's a prominent scholar in this field, and she believes that research can have a hugely positive outcome for Indigenous communities, Māori communities, if it's used in the right way. If there are mechanisms in place to be able to protect respondents and protect knowledge systems, if it's done in a culturally appropriate way, and by engaging yourself against these questions in order to consider while research is occurring. These are just a few examples of some of the questions that Linda Tuiwai-Smith provides as foundational to research in Māori communities, but we wanted to be able to address these and go through a few of them with you. Lee and I made the agreement that if we couldn't answer these questions in good faith for ourselves, or for our partners, or for our advisors, that we would explore other options in research. And this continued throughout the relationship building process until we understood that this was something that communities and the Department of Conservation staff actually wanted. So who defined the research problem? For whom is this study worthy and relevant, and who says so? This research problem was defined by, in partnership with members of Naiiwi, in partnership with the Department of Conservation, and is based out of the recommendations by the Waitangi Tribunal for shared decision-making in Tongariro National Park. This study is worthy and relevant to all involved groups and aims to catalyze further discussion around shared decision-making if that is to be how the park goes into settlement. This was found out through initial discussions and again through the relationship building phase over many months and our introduction of ourselves. So some likely positive outcomes. Again, these conversations aren't really happening. It's in this phase of closed door negotiation. This has been a recommendation, but conversations are happening really among certain levels within DOC, Department of Conservation, or with UB themselves. So some likely positive outcomes. Hopefully, our role as objective outside researchers, by being able to have these conversations in a protective and appropriate way, we're able to catalyze further discussion around how this will happen, out of the understanding that shared decision making is a process that evolves over time. It doesn't start when legislation gets formalized. Likely negative outcomes could also include that we didn't grow up in New Zealand, and it took an incredible amount of work to be able to understand the context around the Waitangi Tribunal process, shared decision making in New Zealand, and one of the potential negative outcomes are that we aren't representing that correctly or accurately. We spend a lot of time focusing on that. So to whom is the research accountable? We were accountable to ourselves, to our partners within members of Naiiwi, and to the Department of Conservation. We're accountable to our advisors and to the Internal Review Board, the Ethics Committee of CSU. And the process is in place to support the research, the researchers, and the researched. I'll cover that here in just a moment. So by implementing Kaupapa research methods, an extensive literature review and formation of case studies, by looking at shared decision-making in Australia, Canada, and the US and New Zealand, to be able to offer as our introduction, based on the wonderful advice of our advisor. And this really helps to build our relationship building phase, rather than with the expectation to come into these communities and look for taking information. We want to be able to offer something to be able to spark these conversations. Also, by co-developing the research questions with members of the Department of Conservation and members of Naiiwi was especially relevant. In addition, using mechanisms with certain groups about how information from our interviews was synthesized and then returned back for review was really important to us and to the groups that we worked with. So our methodology, by using community-based methodologies, we utilize 3 different types of interviews: informal interviews, or less structured, sometimes recorded, sometimes not. If they were not recorded, extensive notes were taken for further analysis. Semi-structured interviews used guiding questions, were always recorded, and those interviews were then transcribed for further analysis. In addition, focus groups allowed us to facilitate broader conversations with Department of Conservation staff and members of Naiiwi around shared decision-making in the park. And respondents were identified using snowball sampling, key gatekeepers in the community that we had the ability to be introduced to early on, proposed with the question, who would be pertinent for us to talk to in this area? And with every following and subsequent interview, we posed that same question to that respondent, and therefore would base our outreach on that. So analysis, we inductively coded the transcribed interviews and the informal interviews by pulling out key codes or key themes of our interviews. We then placed those themes into a broader category or framework using a deductive method for conditions for success to answer some of our research questions. the viability of shared decision-making in the national park, as well as perceptions around strengths and perceptions around challenges. From there, we use intercoded reliability to code these interviews. We started out by coding the same interview individually, and then we came together to make sure that our codes aligned, our themes aligned, and that we were defining things the same way. We did this for 4 interviews in the beginning, 2 Department of Conservation interviews, 2 interviews from members of NAIWI, and then from there we split off the rest of the interviews and coded them individually while checking in with each other every 2 or 3 to make sure that we were still on the same page there. From there, we tallied all the codes of we counted all the tallies from our codes for further analysis later. This is a breakdown of respondents that we were able to speak with. In total, we conducted 48 interviews. Not all of those interviews are represented in an interview count or in the groups down here or in our results. This was by utilizing our Kaupapa research methods due to non-response from certain groups after the synthesis of information. Again, it's important to note that we recognize not all iwi or tribes or hapu that had a relationship to this area and that have a say or a stake in the national park were interviewed, and as well that these groups are absolutely heterogeneous and a much broader group of respondents would be needed to gain an overall understanding. So a number of example questions from our semi-structured interviews include: what do you see the strengths of Department of Conservation and shared decision-making relationship in Tongariro National Park? Are there any foreseeable challenges, and if so, what are they? In addition, what is the present-day relationship like? Has it changed, and if so, how? And do you have a vision for the future of Tongariro National Park, and what is it? So from here on out, we're going to reestablish our research questions and get into our discussion.
So on to addressing our research question, the first of which was, what are the perceived strengths of a shared decision-making relationship between DOC and Na'iwi o Te Kahuimanga, and what are the perceived challenges? Respondents gave a number of strengths that they felt would come out of shared decision-making in Tongariro National Park. One was that the ability to share knowledge and resources would make for a stronger conservation team. Respondents noted that DOC has a lot of knowledge around the management of things like biodiversity and managing for high visitor numbers, while Na'iwi hold a lot of knowledge around traditional ecological knowledge and the cultural values within the park. Respondents also indicated that DOC and Na'iwi have aligned conservation values. They said that both groups want healthy forests, healthy ecosystems, and healthy watersheds. Respondents also felt that more representative decision-making is a strength of shared decision-making in Tongariro National Park. DOC respondents indicated that by allowing another voice in decision-making would cut down some of the bureaucratic red tape that their current decision-making is subject to. Na'iwi respondents indicated that the park can't belong to one entity and that really it belongs to all of us, and therefore decision-making should reflect this, and shared decision-making would be a step towards that. Respondents also indicated that shared decision-making is a step towards allowing Tonga Te Whenua their right to exercise their role as kaitiaki, as guardians, as stewards over their traditional land. As Alex mentioned, Tongariro National Park is revered for its cultural significance. However, a number of respondents indicated that Crown management has not adequately promoted this fact, but that by allowing Tonga Te Whenua a voice in decision-making, that this could be better represented and promoted and recognized in the future. The Waitangi Tribunal concluded that Na'iwi had been excluded from realizing economic benefits from the park, but respondents indicated that by allowing Tonga Te Whenua a say in decision-making, particularly those decisions surrounding the concessionaires and the businesses that are allowed to operate in the park, that Na'iwi would have more access to these economic opportunities. Na'iwi respondents also indicated that shared decision-making would allow Tonga Te Whenua to be able to work on lands in their rohe, in their traditional lands, from which they had been previously excluded. So from some of our respondents, and I'm not going to attempt a New Zealand accent because it would be horrible, but from a DOC respondent, DOC has heaps of skills and knowledge and the resources to do the jobs around biodiversity stuff. On the other side of that coin, iwi hold a huge amount of knowledge around all those things traditionally. The amount of knowledge that they have around plants and the management of these things is just huge. And from a non-iwi respondent, it's just going to open up a floodgate of economic opportunities. and letting us have an equal say. Yeah, it's just going to be so beneficial, not only to us, but to everybody. While respondents gave a number of perceived strengths, they also gave a number of perceived challenges they felt would come out of shared decision making. Alex mentioned that there's a lot of management complexities in Tongariro National Park, from having to manage invasive species, high visitor numbers, active volcanoes, and this massive ski field. Respondents felt that these management complexities would create difficulty in getting consensus in decision making and that it may lead to conflict between the two groups. It was also noted that there's a limited capacity, both in DOC and within iwi. This capacity was in terms of personnel that could be committed to this process, as well as the finance that were needed to manage Tongariro National Park, which has huge budget demands. As we noted, there are multiple iwi that have rohe, their traditional land within park boundaries. Respondents indicated that this was going to be difficult in shared decision making, and that it would be difficult to align these very heterogeneous groups and all these differing opinions to get a unified vision and to get a shared vision. Internal politics were also noted as a challenge in Tongariro. Within DOC, it was noted that there has been instances in the managers in the past that can't agree with one another. They can't agree in their decision making, and they also can't agree in the amount of engagement and the amount of inclusion of not iwi. Internal politics were also noted with not iwi, that there's inner iwi conflict, so conflict among the iwi groups of not iwi, and intra-iwi conflict, and that these conflicts derive from the differing of opinions and the heterogeneity of these communities. Tongariro is revered not only for the environmental and the cultural value that it holds, but also for the economic and recreational opportunities that it provides with world-class walking tracks and the premier ski field on the North Islands. Respondents indicated that balancing the commercial activities in the park with the environmental and cultural values in the park is going to be very difficult for the two groups to come together. It was especially noted that DOC seems to be becoming an increasingly commercialized agency, that they're making their decisions based on the economic gains now instead of the environmental and cultural protection. Respondents also noted that there's the potential resistance from the public if this park is to go towards shared decision making. They indicated other national parks in New Zealand that have gone towards shared decision making and the large backlash that these parks received from the public. This was due to the idea that there's the potential for Tangata Whenua to close off areas that the New Zealand public had access to previously, or that Tangata Whenua might want to increase things like hunting permits and the price that you have to pay for that. And that this would most likely happen in Tongariro National Park because Tongariro National Park is such an iconic park for New Zealand. Lastly, respondents noted that there is no locally shared vision and that there will be difficulty in cultivating a shared vision. This difficulty will come not only in cultivating a shared vision between DOC and not iwi, but also in not iwi's ability to come together and create a unified vision among themselves. Again, from some respondents and from a DOC respondent, and there's a wrestle with Tongariro because the national park now straddles iwi boundaries, and we're going to end up with inner iwi disputes. And the more you're in a co-governance thing where you're tied into their structures, the more we get caught up in that stuff. And on public resistance from a not iwi respondent, I think the fears from the general public to the politicians are pretty loud, and that keeps the politicians from making the right decisions from our perspective in terms of how we would like to see code management and decision making happening. So with these perceived strengths and challenges in mind, we were interested in exploring, is Tongariro National Park a viable setting for shared decision making? We addressed this question in two different ways. The first, looking at the people on the ground. What are they saying? What are their perceptions? Do they believe that Tongariro National Park is a viable setting? And then we also applied the 8 characteristics from the literature to the Tongariro National Park context. Overwhelmingly, the people that we spoke with did believe that Tongariro National Park was a viable setting. They gave a number of reasonings for this, but a lot of them had to deal with the necessity of including the Tangata Whenua voice in decision-making because of the cultural significance of the park, because of their sacred connection to the manga, to the mountains, and because of the historical significance of the park. It was noted again the mutual interests between DOC and not iwi, so these aligned conservation values that make it a viable setting, and also that shared decision-making would enhance visitor experience, increasing the visibility of Tongariro National Park into the future. Respondents also noted Tangata Whenua's multi-generational vision, so that Tangata Whenua would think and plan on scales of hundreds of years and not 5 to 10 years, and that this would lead to more effective and adaptable decision-making, which makes it a viable setting. Not iwi respondents did indicate that they believe that Tongariro National Park is a viable setting, But they did also emphasize that shared decision-making is merely a step in the process, and that this should continue to evolve over time, and that their right and role as kaitiaki and rangatira should continue to evolve and expand through time. There were 3 respondents that indicated that they did not think that Tongariro National Park was a viable setting. One felt that if this was to be a true partnership, then that shared decision-making should occur not only on docklands, but on iwi lands as well. Another respondent indicated that there aren't many good examples that show that shared decision-making can occur between a federal agency and an indigenous people, and that this didn't give much hope for Tongariro. The third was of 2 minds, that it would depend on treaty negotiations and these outcomes and the political will of the day. So again, from the respondents, nice and simply, an appropriate setting, I don't think you'll get a better one. And from a not iwi respondent, yes, I absolutely think it is an appropriate setting. I have had a view that this is what our mountains want us to do, and I say that from a more spiritual level. I do think it's an absolute appropriate setting. So keeping in mind that the people on the ground really do believe that Tongariro is a valuable setting, we applied the 8 characteristics to this context. From our analysis and our evaluation, we felt that there were 3 characteristics that are evident currently in Tongariro. Those were commitment to the process, valuing and utilizing diverse knowledge types, and strong leadership. And that there were 5 characteristics that still need development within this context. And those were trust, adaptability, equitable power sharing, utilizing effective decision-making and conflict resolution processes, and communication. So the 3 that were evident, the first, commitment to the process. Each group was able to indicate its own commitment to the process. DOC respondents indicated that they were committed because they really believed that Tongata Whenua deserved a voice in decision-making. They also noted Section 4 of the Conservation Act, which requires DOC to give effect to the Treaty of Waitangi to have a partnership with Tongata Whenua. Not iwi respondents indicated their commitment because they believe that shared decision-making is a step towards realizing their role as kaitiaki, as stewards, as guardians over this land. Respondents also noted works that are already in progress that show a relationship beginning to form even before treaty settlement and negotiations has begun. There was reference to a co-management arrangement that started between DOC and Ngātirangi on a forest, as well as restoration efforts on Mount Ruapehu. Respondents also indicated that there's capacity building efforts going on between the groups to increase communication and outreach among themselves. There was also evidence to suggest that the partnership will be able to value and utilize diverse knowledge types. Local DOC staff especially indicated this deep appreciation and recognition for the knowledge and the cultural and the sacred connection that Tongata Whenua, not iwi, have to this manga, to the mountain. We got examples of how DOC staff bring in members of not iwi to train their own staff about traditional ecological knowledge and how this can be incorporated into their own management and the deep cultural values that exist in Tongariro. It was also noted that DOC is working to increase its cultural recognition, so staff are now getting trained in culturally appropriate outreach mechanisms, and DOC is hiring PO, these are liaison positions, where DOC staff can go to and to get advice on how to interact with Tongata Whenua, with not iwi. It was also noted that DOC has a changing attitude. They're beginning to hire more and more Tongata Whenua in different various levels within their organization to change the culture of their organization to become more inclusive. Some not iwi respondents also indicated that some of the DOC management's knowledge will be beneficial to incorporate in the future partnership and management in the park. Lastly, there's evidence to suggest that there can be strong leadership within this partnership. Strong leaders were identified both within DOC and in not iwi. Within DOC, again, these leaders that exist at multiple levels that are working to change the culture of the organization to become more inclusive. Within that iwi, leaders were identified, and these leaders were identified as bringing together and unifying these iwis to create a shared vision, to create a unified front to present to the Crown in partnership. Most notably, respondents indicated the role of the G6 Kahui Manga Collective Group. This is a group of iwi leaders that is currently working and meeting monthly to create this shared vision, to think very broadly and strategically, to create a unified vision to present to the Crown as one not iwi o te kahui manga. Respondents placed a deep importance on this group, some even indicating that if this group is to fail, shared decision-making will fail in Tongariro National Park. While we do feel these characteristics are evident in the park, there are characteristics that we feel need further development, the first of which was trust. Respondents gave some indication that they feel that trust can exist between the partnership, most notably noting the strong local relationship that exists between local DOC staff and members of not iwi. However, there were significant barriers to developing trust that were reported. The first of which was the past actions that have occurred in the park. Time and again, respondents noted the ski field and the development ski field that was allowed on this sacred manga. A few years ago, the business that operates the ski field applied for a new concession with DOC to build up further on the manga. DOC took this concession application to Tonga Te Whenua for their input. They deeply expressed that they did not want this to happen. DOC went against this and allowed this concession to go further, and this ski field was built further up the mountain. Respondents also noted that there's high staff turnover within iwi, but more predominantly within DOC. This high staff turnover creates problems in building relationships and building trust. Respondents also noted closed-minded staff, again, both within not iwi and in DOC, that these closed-minded staff have a very us versus them attitude and a mistrusting attitude of one another. Lastly, respondents noted a disparity between local DOC staff and DOC national office, where local DOC staff is more willing to go farther in engagement and relationship building with Tonga Te Whenua than national DOC office is really comfortable with. So with some respondent answers from a DOC staff member, I think largely what soured the relationship with the park was the commercial developments. What iwi could see were these enormous ski field developments, many of which I think were a serious mistake, creeping higher and higher up the mountain. And I think they didn't like it, and they had no say over it, and I'm not sure that we've still got it sorted. And from a not iwi respondent, DOC are focused on the well-being of flora and fauna. It's that simple, and they will bulldoze dwellings and move not just occupants, they will move people that are integrated into that flora and fauna. The indigenous fauna and the indigenous people are so integrated that they preserve each other. But DOC take one slice of that and identify it as being a danger to the park. We also think that adaptability could be further developed in the park. Respondents from each group were able to highlight their own adaptability. So DOC mentioned that they go through these periods of adaptive management where they review their conservation goals and then adapt to better reach these goals. Not iwi highlighted their own adaptability, stating that they've had to adapt through decades of political change. However, it remains unclear how this partnership can come together to be adaptable. One way in which this is unclear is that DOC is perceived to be really inflexible. And this was noted in due to the fact that DOC is a crown agency, so it's responsible to the government of the day. So when a new party comes into power in parliament, oftentimes DOC will change its value and its policies. Local DOC staff is also heavily restricted by the national legislation. So they may want to go farther in engagement, but ultimately they have to answer to a number of pieces of legislation and the policies set by national office. Respondents also noted that there is difficulty in bridging Western processes with Māori processes. So while these groups have completely separate processes that they both deem effective, it was unclear to respondents how they can both adapt and come together to build an adaptable partnership. From respondents on adaptability, and some people can adapt to changing circumstances. Some people are willing to adapt to it. Others just say, no, I've been doing this for so many years, or this is not the way that I want to do it. So that's where I see the challenge as is. There also seems that there needs to be more mechanisms to be able to equitably share power between the partners. Respondents noted that DOC does appear to be moving away from this we know best attitude and is becoming more inclusive. However, there are a lot of significant factors that show that there will be an inability to equitably share power within this partnership. Most notably from respondents, they felt that DOC is perceived to be asserting authority and that DOC will always have the final say in decision making. Respondents gave the example that DOC has 3 values on which they make decisions: a cultural value, an environmental value, and a historical value. So when they reach out for engagement in Tonga Te Whenua can say, this negatively impacts our cultural value in the park. But if that decision is in favor of DOC's historical and environmental values, they will ultimately make that decision against iwi wishes and for their own wishes. It was also noted by respondents that DOC is unwilling to relinquish control of Tongariro National Park management. Respondents indicated that this was because the Crown has a high investment in Tongariro National Park due to its role as an economic driver of the North Island, as well as the recognition that Tongariro National Park has internationally. From respondents, and to me, partnership means both parties sitting at the table as equals, which is a big challenge for an empirical scientific organization like DOC's. It means equals in terms of traditional knowledge versus scientific knowledge. Very often it's all animals are created equal, but some animals are created more equal than others. And that is, in all honesty, something the department struggles with, and I see that on a working level. And the feedback that I've seen from legal and the higher up doc is that they don't want to release control. We also feel that there needs to be further development in the partnership's ability to utilize context-specific decision-making and conflict resolution mechanisms. Respondents indicated that their own groups have strengths in their decision-making processes, so DOC thinks on a nationalized system, and they feel that this is really effective for their management of the national parks, whereas NOT-UE noted that they think very place-based. They make decisions very place-based and holistically, and that this is better and more beneficial for Tongariro National Park. But however, it does seem that there will be difficulty in merging these processes. Again, respondents noted the difficulty in bridging Western and Morny decision-making processes. A NOT-UE respondent gave the example that when DOC does engage in outreach and asks for feedback on a decision, the time frame that they allow is not an appropriate amount of time that EWE need to bring this decision to their wider EWE, which is very important and valuable for their decision-making process. It was also noted that there is difficulty in bridging these processes because DOC thinks from this very Western view of conservation, where it's a hands-off kind of conservation, and NOT-UE make decisions around conservation where they want to be able to use and sustainably use the land. Again, respondents noted the difficulty in merging DOC thinking on a very nationalized system and NOT-UE wanting to make decisions at place. And lastly, while respondents gave many instances where they noted conflict between DOC and NOT-UE, there was very little evidence of successful conflict mediation between these two groups. From respondents, the difficulty in thinking nationally and locally. Now, the Crown has always resisted having anybody able, at a local level, to dictate how much money will be spent in the park and broadly what it will be spent on, because we run on a nationally integrated system, and we do not want to start having our budget divided geographically. And the same goes with tourism infrastructure. We try to look at it at a national level and try to think where there is a reasonable range of recreational opportunities in each region. And from a NOT-UE respondent, European conservation puts things in a glass bubble so you can only see it and view it. You want to keep it in its pristine state. For us, conservation, we live in that. We live in that environment. We are part of that environment. And so we want to use that environment and sustainably use it and interact with it. Lastly, we feel that there needs to be efforts put forth to develop communication between the partnership. There was some indication of open and clear communication, again, going back to these local relationships that seem to exist at place between local DOC staff and members of NOT-UE, but there were several instances given by respondents that show a lack of communication. Respondents indicated that historically, DOC has had a lack of outreach to an engagement with NOT-UE, and that really DOC doesn't know how to engage appropriately with Tongata Whenua. Respondents again indicated to high staff turnovers at place within DOC, and that these high staff turnovers really hinder the relationship building process that's very vital to iwi, and that these relationship processes not being able to be built hinders the communication that can happen. Again noted was the disparity between local DOC staff and national office, where local DOC staff are more willing to engage at a higher level with iwi and have these conversations more openly than national office will allow. Respondents also noted that there seems to be a lack of communication between the different iwis that make up NOT-UE Ote Kahui Manga, and that when DOC has engaged in outreach with NOT-UE, that sometimes they get inconsistent responses back. From respondents, DOC responded, you know you need to talk to iwi, but you're not quite sure who to talk to and what their response is going to be. And from a NOT-UE respondent, I don't think there are enough conversations between Ngāti Tuwharetoa, Ngāti Uanuku, and Ngāti Rangi about what the end prize looks like in terms of a co-management structure. So what does all of those results mean? We feel strongly that there's a very strong buy-in and belief that shared decision-making is the appropriate decision in Tongariro National Park. However, there were significant barriers to some of the key findings from the literature. It also does appear, though, that these barriers could come out of treaty settlement, and that this park hasn't gone into treaty negotiations, and so this partnership hasn't yet been formalized. The aim of our research was to hopefully catalyze conversations between the Department of Conservation and members of NOT-UE, and we feel that if these conversations can begin now, preempting treaty negotiations, that this will lead to a more resilient, adaptable, and equitable relationship post-settlement. There are certain areas that we think that these groups should focus on going forward.
So some areas for further critical thought and further research. I think it's important for groups to be able to clearly define the strengths and the challenges of shared decision making. For example, respondents indicated that there was a lack of resources and in some cases capacity in certain groups, and respondents also indicated that they'd like to be able to use each other's resources, infrastructure, training, and personnel. But it's important for both groups to understand fully what each group brings to the table in transparent and direct conversations. In addition, being able to address the disparities between local doc staff and national office came up time and time again. This came up in terms of communication, trust building, engagement with Tonga Whenua, and there needs to be mechanisms in place if Tongariro National Park goes into shared decision making that these disparities are addressed. One of those major disparities includes balancing the use and protection in the park. Respondents indicated time and again that there was a desire to be able to remove some development in the park, that development shouldn't have happened in the first place in certain areas, and that with increasing tourism numbers in the park itself, when is enough enough? Where is there a limit? Is there a cap? In addition, the role of people in decisions at place needs to be discussed further. It's important that members of Na'iwi and Tonga Whenua value local long-term relationships on the ground in a huge way, and same with local dock staff members. Respondents indicated high dock staff turnover, restructures, and some turnover within iwi trust boards, and that these had a dramatic and negative effect on building trust and being able to know who to talk to in certain situations. In addition, being able to enhance mechanisms to integrate Western and Maori processes and knowledge. Respondents indicated, and we saw firsthand that there are mechanisms in place, but these need to be enhanced. In addition, the power imbalance of treaty settlement outcomes is one of the major disparities that we noted in our research. It was noted by respondents that treaty settlement can never fully redress what was lost during colonization, and this could have huge ramifications if it carries over into a shared decision-making relationship. Partners need to be able to discuss what their bottom line is for entering in a shared decision-making relationship, if that ends up being one of the outcomes. And last but certainly not least, it is the right of Tonga Whenua to be able to represent their cultural connection to the park in whatever way they see fit. And respondents indicated time and time again, there is nothing in the park that actually represents this significant connection.
We read a lot of literature, and cited a lot of literature, and here it is for you. We also have a huge amount of people, a number of people that we need to thank, and I'm sure this list doesn't know justice. But first and foremost, our advisor, Brett Lawrence Briere.
You know that.
He Skyped with us at really weird hours of the night. He read through a ridiculously long first draft of our thesis, and he worked to understand this new context in New Zealand that was a world away from Kenya, and we're really grateful for that.
In addition, of course, our secondary advisors, Rebecca Gruby and Robin Reed. You are tough ladies, and you held us to a high standard, and we appreciate your critical approach, and you really pushed us to do our best, so thank you.
To Richard Willis, who is our in-country contact, and to his family, he provided us with a lot of advice, more coffees than we could ever count, and a warm bed whenever we were in Wellington.
And Amy Satterfield, who is CLTL 3.0, she was foundational in getting us to New Zealand and introducing this concept of this research to us, and we're forever grateful for that.
To all the people that we met and talked with in New Zealand, thank you for giving us your time, for sharing with us, and for trusting us with this valuable information.
Of course, to our CLTL family, all of our classmates, and our wonderful program coordinator, and all of the other professors that have had such a huge impact on our work. Thank you very much.
To our family and friends, our family that came to New Zealand and visited us and gave us a break from our thesis, we're super grateful. And thank you to our friends for Skyping long hours and keeping our sanity intact.
And in addition, those that gave us scholarships in various capacities, including the Rotary Club. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, nice job to the two. Very nice job. Let's do maybe up to 10 minutes or so of Q&A from the larger group, and then we'll we'll reconvene with just a smaller group. So let's kind of open it up to whoever, and you guys can kind of facilitate this on who gets called on and who doesn't.
A comment and a question. First of all, I really thought it was interesting that you understood pretty clearly at some point that creating kinship, changes and so forth, was sort of the crux of what needs to happen. It's like the juice, and that it's not overnight. I mean, there's a lot of history. I think those things can change, but it does take a big, huge commitment to see beyond, the color of your skin, your eyes, your own history, both sides. So that was really interesting. The other thing I think is a question I have is, if you are a Native person who is so spiritually tied into that, it's not a lot of negotiating. There's symbols involved which are not amenable to sort of typical Western horse trading.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's issues in our country, abortion, et cetera. I mean, the same kind of thing that don't sort of fit into the typical horse trading, compromising kind of situation. And if you're living in a place where the earth itself is, and you are so tied in, how does that unfold, relative to coming up against another culture that says, well, let's just swap, 400 yards of ski area for, you know what I'm saying?
I mean,
just some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's an exhausting process to be able to explain yourself over and over and over, and to try to be able to, you're always sharing your own knowledge system, and so that somebody else can try to understand that. Conversations that we would have, friends that were weeping about how connected they were to the mountains. You really can't put that into words. I think you're right. It raises huge complexities when trying to put that into a Western system, a Western framework. Having to represent yourself as a trust board, having lawyers that represent you. It's actually a pretty devastating process to be able to watch. Yeah.
Eric.
Do you guys each have a personal or professional highlight that really stands out, like a day or a certain meeting or a certain conversation with one of these people that just kind of totally floored you, or kind of, I don't know, really struck home or anything like that?
A lot.
Yeah.
I think, I think for me, being able to have these conversations and being able to attempt to understand, I won't say that I do understand what these mountains really mean and the sacred connection that's to it, that these people have to them, that was really meaningful for me. And I remember I took a weekend just by myself to go to the national park, and I didn't even want to do anything. I just wanted to sit there and just be in the presence of these life forces, these mountains. And after hearing all of these stories, you really begin to feel it, and it becomes, I'm just so grateful that was always shared with us, that I could try to learn and try to understand what these mountains really mean.
Yeah, for me, I'm gonna go a little different route. One of our trips that we got to take right before we left on the Wanganui River is an incredibly amazing place. We spent 3 days kayaking the river itself, and just out of this world. It's absolutely stunning. So that for me, there were 4 or 5 hours where we wouldn't even say a word to each other. We were just paddling along. So it was an incredible experience. Anybody else?
Was there any discussion between the iwi and the DOC about fiscal responsibilities for the shared governance of the park? Mm-hmm. And in my trip there, I noticed that there are very few entrance fees. What I thought was great, because it is people's land, the iwi's land. But that would be a sticking point, I'm thinking, on negotiations. Who's going to pay for maintenance and conservation and all that? Yeah. Is there discussions? Has anybody brought that up?
I'm sure it's going to happen. That's part of the negotiation process. It's in such an early stage that we aren't aware of at what level they're having those conversations, how defined. This is only one potential outcome of how the park will be settled. So I'm sure those conversations will happen.
Yeah, that was kind of another interesting finding that we didn't really talk about here, but only like DOC respondents really talked about how much money it takes to run Tongariro National Park. It's huge. And so just kind of with that only being DOC respondents, is there an understanding from that Iwi how much money it actually takes? And then also with both groups thinking that they could use each other's resources, but then both groups being like, we don't have resources. Yeah, just that's going to be really important going forward.
And generally from respondents from IUE, they felt like that resources shouldn't necessarily be taken from them because they're going through this redress process, that it should be funded by the Crown because the Crown was the one that implicated this in its colonial actions. So it'll be really controversial.
Like in the context of the iwi's, like their context of conservation of being able to like use the land for themselves, like to what extent, you know, because it potentially could not. I mean, you see in our context here in America that probably isn't an option anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe, you know, but how, like to what far, like where do you draw the line? You know, does like someone step in and be like, hey, you know, these birds are kind of, as an example, they're kind of disappearing. Like you guys need to, you know, like what's that context? Like how do they?
Yeah. So yeah, it's pretty heavily regulated. I mean, with some Tonga species or treasured species for the whenua, some are incredibly rare and are really suffering, and therefore they're not able to harvest them. I think that is an end goal in places for birds to be able to be harvested in that way. But it depends place to place, and it depends on the species itself.
You think that some of them want to rely exclusively on the land, or is that like?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Nobody that we spoke with that is looking that far ahead. I think the context of the country has changed, you know, forever so much that you know, it's not a massive country as well. Development has happened in many corners of the country, so I'm not sure how that could actually happen. But more for cultural purposes, spiritual purposes, I think how that harvesting could happen. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to cut, but I do want to sort of recognize that, you know, the topic that I think you guys get a lot of credit for figuring out something that is so important to you. And I just think of a lot of the Skype conversations we had where you were second guessing yourself at times when you didn't need to be because it was so important to you to do this right, to do it the right way, and that there was some sensitivities around it. And it's great to sort of see that you found something that's so part of who you are. I mean, you've applied for a job for it that we hope it works out. You start a job that goes this type of stuff in a couple of weeks, and you found a path for yourself. And it was really great to see over those 6 or 7 months go from, okay, you're not going to Kenya, what are you doing, to finding something that just fit the two of you so well. So anyhow, you did a great job. And we got more questions for you, but we're going to let most of the folks go.